Hey everyone, it's Chrono from the Headphone Show. Today with me I have the Dunu SA6. Let's check it out. So the Studio SA6, or just simply SA6 as it's more commonly known, is a mid-range IEM from Dunu that retails at $549.99. As may be suggested by its name, it's utilizing 6 balanced armature drivers that cover different frequency ranges. Now, as always, we'll start off by taking a look at the headphones accessories, of which the SA6 includes a pretty sweet array. Inside their rather colorful box, you'll first be greeted by a blue Dunu carrying case, which, despite being what I describe as being of a medium size, does have a low profile that keeps it easily pocketable. Also included is a generous assortment of silicone ear tips. I will note right away though that despite the difference in their colors as well as varying driver opening sizes, I personally cannot discern any acoustic difference between them, at least not a significant one. Last but definitely not least, there is the stock cable, which is an 8-core silver-plated braided OCC cable that measures 1.2 meters in length. For the headphone end, it's using 2-pin connectors, and then for the source end, it features Dunu's modular plug system, which is a locking mechanism that lets you swap between the included 3.5mm single-ended, 4.4mm balanced, and 2.5mm balanced terminations. Moving on to build and comfort, the build on the SA6 is both very sturdy and visually appealing. Similar to that of the Blessing 2, it's using a resin see-through shell that, although tinted a bit darker, does allow you to peek into the IEMs components. As for the faceplates, Dunu has utilized beautiful pieces of stabilized solid wood that are dipped in ink of varying colors, which results in no two sets of SA6 headphones looking the same. As for comfort, the SA6 is excellent, and it's the IEM that I've found easiest to wear in prolonged listening sessions. Like the Blessing 2, it's on the larger side for IEMs, which could cause some discomfort for users with smaller ears. However, the chassis features an incredibly well-contoured mold that naturally fits the shape of the human ear. Also worthy of mention is that with the abundance of ear tips included, I'm sure that users won't have a hard time finding a set that fits them nicely and gets them a good seal with the IEM. Alright, so now let's talk about sound, and for its driver configuration, the SA6 is using 6 balanced armature drivers, 2 Sony and Accupass vented dual woofers for bass frequencies, 2 Knowles custom mid-range drivers, and a Knowles custom dual tweeter driver for the treble frequencies. Now, when I first sat down to listen to the SA6, I was immediately reminded of the Blessing 2, which is an IEM that I very much enjoyed when I reviewed it just a couple of months ago, and it's one that I still hold as my tonal benchmark for IEMs today. So it's got a very pleasant and musical presentation with a tonality that I describe as being slightly warm to neutral. As is always the case, we'll first talk about the SA6 bass, and the bass region on here to me sounded as though it was adequately contoured. It's got a well-defined bass shelf under 150Hz that for my taste and preferences sits at just the right level, offering some warmth and depth for the bass region, even more so than on the Blessing 2. In case you want more bass though, there is a switch at the back of the unit that allows you to activate what Dunu has dubbed their atmospheric immersion mode when set to the on position, and it's essentially a bass boost. Admittedly, it's not the most pronounced boost, as to me it sounded as though there was less than a 5 dB increment when turned on, but having the ability to draw just a bit more rumble out of the headphone is a neat option to have. Now, if there was one thing that particularly stood out to me from the SA6's bass region was that although the lows were actually very present, they didn't deliver much of an impact, which is not very surprising given that the SA6 does not feature a dynamic driver. Aside from that though, I really enjoyed the SA6 bass response. It was remarkably articulate for an IEM this price bracket, and it was still properly textured. Moving along to the mids, the mid-range tuning on the SA6 is fantastic, with a rich body and lush overtones. Compared to the Blessing 2, which could occasionally come through as just a little bit shouty, the SA6 instead has an upper mid-range that feels cooled down a touch, but it still has good presence. So overall, it's a delightful and linear mid-range tuning that feels organic, and it keeps vocals and instruments like pianos sounding natural. Lastly, for tonality, we have the highs, and the treble region on the SA6 is for the most part quite warm, though I did find it to be just ever so slightly uneven. To me, it sounded as though there was a bit of an emphasis between 6.5 to 8K. Thankfully, this was fairly subtle, it didn't really introduce any sibilance, and it didn't make the SA6 fatiguing in any way. However, I did find that certain instruments' timbre could feel slightly off as a result. Listening to electric guitars, for example, did sound to me as though they had their upper harmonics just a little bit unnaturally brightened, which in turn made them sound a bit tinnier. Similarly, certain percussive instruments like snare drums had a more pronounced bite, whilst other instruments like cymbals had a more present sizzle. Once again, I'll reiterate that this was subtle, and I personally didn't find it to be as bothersome as the Blessing 2's 5K peak, or definitely not as much as the 6K peak on the Polaris. It's still a good tuning for the treble range that extends nicely into the upper registers above 10K, and it properly nuances the highs. Moving on to technical performance, we'll first talk about resolution, and for its detail retrieval and overall sense of clarity, I feel as though the SA6 delivers outstanding performance for the price bracket that it's in. Throughout the entire frequency range, it produces a stable and pristine image of the music with vocal and instrument lines. They're well textured and structured, even in busy passages. In my personal opinion, I feel as though the SA6 is ahead in this regard when compared to a lot of the other IEMs in this price bracket. And again, for me personally, I feel as though it actually creates a more a cleaner image overall than the Andromeda 2020, and it gets dangerously close to something like the IE900, and both of these are IEMs that nearly double it in price. Then as for its spatial qualities, for its soundstage presentation, I'd definitely describe the SA6 as being pretty intimate. Despite the small stage it has to work with though, it creates a decently spacious listening atmosphere by virtue of its instrument separation and imaging. It's got pretty good left-right localization and seemingly no gaps that would break the soundstage, which allows it to easily delineate the positioning and directionality of sound. Then as for layering, it's adept at distinguishing all the different vocal and instrument lines within the mix, giving them their own defined space in the stage. Lastly, we have dynamics, and as I previously noted, the omission of a dynamic driver in the SA6 means that unfortunately it won't do much in the way of delivering a strong sense of punch and slam. It's not to say that it won't carry any impact in the lows, but it's definitely outperformed in this regard by pretty much all other IEMs I've reviewed. Now, it does slightly redeem itself as it does retain some tactility in the upper registers, but what I'm trying to say is that if you're looking for a punchy IEM, I would not have the SA6 as my first pick. Okay, so now to wrap up this review, as I mentioned earlier, the SA6 reminds me in both its tonality and presentation of the Blessing 2. However, to me, it feels as though it's a slight refinement over the Blessing 2. And when I look at the SA6 tonal differences to the Blessing 2, I feel as though it pretty much has what I would have wanted to see had I used EQ on the latter. Additionally, I appreciate the soundstage and detail retrieval gains that it has to offer, even if it concedes in the dynamics department. I think that for the listening experience it delivers at $549, the SA6 undoubtedly sets a standard for IEMs under $1,000. Needless to say then, with its exceptional tonal balance and technical performance, the SA6 gets a very strong recommendation from me. It's a great headphone that is definitely worth experiencing. Anyways, that is all for me today. I hope you enjoyed this video or found it useful. If you did, do consider dropping a like. If you'd like to learn more about the SA6 or other headphones, I highly encourage you to check out the review section available on headphones.com. For more headphone audio content, stay tuned by subscribing to The Headphone Show, and until next time, this is Chrono signing off.